There's a question buried inside every image of the samurai that popular culture has ever produced. The lacquered armor, the curved blade, the rigid posture of a warrior standing apart from ordinary men. The question is simple, almost embarrassingly practical, and it cuts straight through centuries of romanticized mythology. How did these men actually get paid? Not in the abstract, not philosophically, in rice, in land, in seasonal disbursements measured out by bureaucrats who tracked every koku of grain produced on domain land, in stipends that arrived or failed to arrive, depending on the health of a lord's finances, the outcome of a harvest, or the shifting politics of a feudal hierarchy that had its own pressures, its own shortfalls, and its own very real tendency to leave warriors waiting. That gap between the idealized image of the samurai and the grinding material reality of how samurai actually survived is exactly what this script is about. Because when you ask how samurai got paid, you are really asking something much larger. You are asking how an entire warrior class was organized, controlled, motivated, and managed across centuries of Japanese history. You're asking what it meant to serve a lord not in ceremony, but in economic fact. You're asking what a man with a sword and a formal title actually owned, what he depended on, and what happened when that dependency failed. The answer is more complicated and more human than most people expect. To understand samurai compensation, you have to understand what samurai actually were. And that means setting aside the image almost immediately. The samurai were not a single fixed type. They were a social and military class whose composition, function, and economic situation changed substantially across more than 7 centuries of Japanese history. The warrior serving a provincial lord in the late 10th century lived in a world completely unlike that of the Edo period samurai managing administrative paperwork in the 18th century. Both received compensation, but the form of that compensation and the daily reality it produced were entirely different. What held them together across time was the fundamental structure of their service. A samurai served a lord, a daimyo, a shogun, a regional power, and in exchange received the means to sustain himself, his household, and the subordinates who depended on him in turn. He was, above all, a dependent. His income was tied to his lord, his social position, his legal standing, and his ability to maintain the equipment and appearance expected of his class. All of it ran through that relationship. That relationship was not abstract. It was formalized, tracked, recorded, and audited with considerable bureaucratic care. The currency of samurai compensation across most of the feudal period was rice. Specifically, it was measured in koku, a unit of volume representing roughly the amount of rice needed to feed one adult in 1 year, approximately 180 liters of grain. This was not a decorative unit of measure. It was the fundamental accounting language of feudal Japanese military and political life. When sources recorded that a samurai held a fief assessed at 500 koku, or that a retainer received 30 koku annually, those numbers described real agricultural output, real land productivity, and real military capacity. A domain, a han, was assessed for its total productive capacity in koku. The daimyo drew his power and his ability to field warriors directly from that assessment. A domain controlling territory assessed at 100,000 koku commanded very different resources than one controlling 10,000. And within that domain, the samurai retainers received their compensation as a portion of that same agricultural wealth. For much of the earlier feudal period, during the Sengoku era of near-constant warfare in the 15th and 16th centuries, the most direct form of this arrangement was land tenure. A samurai of sufficient rank would receive actual land, a village or portion of a village, the right to collect taxes from its farmers, and the responsibility to administer and defend it. This was fief-holding in its most literal form. The samurai was not handed a bag of rice. He was handed the right to extract rice from a specific piece of productive earth. That right came with obligations that were physical and immediate. The samurai holding a fief was expected to know his territory, deal with the farmers that worked it, manage disputes, and maintain his own fighting capacity out of what that land produced. Armor needed periodic repair. Swords required maintenance. Travel to answer a lord's summons cost money in provisions and lodging, and wear on sandals and footwear that deteriorated faster than most accounts acknowledge. The shift that changed this system fundamentally happened across the late 16th and early 17th centuries as Toyotomi Hideyoshi and then Tokugawa Ieyasu consolidated control over Japan and moved towards the long stability of the Edo period. One of the most consequential administrative changes of that era was the systematic separation of warriors from the land. Under the policies associated with Hideyoshi's cadastral surveys and then formalized under Tokugawa governance, samurai were increasingly required to leave their rural fiefs and relocate to castle towns, the urban centers growing around the residences of domain lords. The samurai who had once lived on and managed his land, collecting his own taxes directly from farmers he knew personally, was now urbanized. He lived in a neighborhood designated for warriors. He reported to administrative structures rather than to fields and villages. Instead of collecting revenue directly from land, most samurai now received stipends, fixed annual or semi-annual payments measured in rice or increasingly in cash equivalents, disbursed by the domain's financial administration. The fief holder became, in practical terms, a salaried bureaucrat with a military title and a set of ritual expectations. The stipend system was not uniform. It varied by domain, by rank, by period, and by the financial health of the Han's treasury. But in its general form, a samurai of a given rank was assigned a stipend rating, expressed in koku. That rating determined how much rice, or its cash equivalent, he received per payment cycle. In many domains, payments were made twice a year, roughly aligned with harvest seasons. In others, disbursements came quarterly or monthly. The exact schedule varied considerably by domain and era. A higher-ranking retainer might receive hundreds of koku annually. A lower-ranking samurai, a foot soldier by title, a document handler in practice, might receive 5 koku or even less. And what 5 koku actually meant in daily life was not generous. After feeding a household, maintaining clothing appropriate to samurai status, keeping weapons and armor in serviceable condition, and meeting the social obligations that came with belonging to the warrior class, there was often very little left. Records from multiple domains in the mid to late Edo period show samurai households operating under persistent financial strain, supplementing income through side work, making small handicrafts, tutoring children of merchants, while maintaining the outward posture of a class that was not supposed to soil itself with trade. The mechanics of actually receiving the stipend were not clean or frictionless. In most domains, a samurai did not simply appear at a granary and collect his rice. The disbursement went through administrative channels, and the rice itself, heavy, perishable, requiring storage, was often converted to cash through a network of dealers and brokers operating in and around castle towns. These merchants, from the chonin class ranked officially below samurai in the Confucian-influenced social order of Tokugawa Japan, became essential intermediaries. A samurai who needed cash would sell his rice stipend in advance of receiving it to brokers who charged fees and interest for the service. This created a structural irony that was not lost on contemporaries. The warrior class, which officially ranked above merchants in the social order, was, in practical economic terms, dependent on those same merchants for its own income. Samurai who sold future stipends at discounted rates to access immediate cash were in effect taking loans secured by their official income. By the mid-Edo period, debt was a common condition in samurai households across Japan, and domain records document repeated edicts attempting to manage or cancel the debts lower-ranking retainers had accumulated with commercial creditors. The samurai's rice stipend was, in theory, his secure income. In practice, it was a number on a ledger that passed through multiple hands before becoming anything he could actually use. Housing was, in many cases, provided or subsidized by the domain. A retainer occupied a residence allocated according to rank, larger homes with grounds for senior retainers, cramped row houses for those of modest standing. These were not personal property. They were tied to the position, and they left with it. For samurai in active military roles during campaigns,
Additional provisions came in the form of field rations and access to the campaign's supply chain. Surviving accounts described the logistics of feeding armies in motion: rice cooked in field conditions, dried fish, pickled vegetables, and compact dried rice cakes that could be reconstituted with water and carried in a small bag. What a samurai ate on campaign depended on his rank, the wealth of his lord, and how efficiently the logistical apparatus was holding together under pressure. The hierarchy of service was mirrored exactly in the hierarchy of provision. Senior retainers had servants to prepare food and manage equipment. Lower-ranking infantry ate from a much simpler table. A retainer who accompanied his lord on the Sankin Kotai journeys, the Tokugawa requirement that daimyo spent alternating years in Edo, faced particular costs: lodging along the Tokaido Road, the cost of appropriate appearance for a formal procession, the feeding of the entourage. All of it came out of household funds. The gap between stipend income and the actual cost of these journeys was a persistent strain, especially in the entourages of smaller domains. The range of economic experience within the samurai class was enormous. At the upper end, a senior retainer, a kato, a senior official with significant administrative authority, might hold a stipend of several thousand koku. His residence would be substantial, his household staffed with servants, his food varied and refined. He would own several sets of lacquered armor maintained by retainers whose specific job it was to care for them. He traveled with an entourage. At the lower end, a sandal bearer in a peacetime castle town might receive 5 koku or fewer. His housing was cramped. His diet was rice and whatever preserved additions he could manage. His single set of armor, if he had armor of quality, was likely his most valuable possession and the thing he most carefully maintained. He carried messages, guarded gates, ran errands for higher-ranking retainers who paid him little direct attention, and supplemented his income through craft work done quietly at home.
Between these extremes were the vast middle ranks who formed the working infrastructure of domain administration: retainers managing records, overseeing assessments, handling correspondence, performing the 100 practical tasks of running a military domain in peacetime. They received stipends that kept them functional, but not comfortable. They maintained appearances carefully, because in a social order where appearance determined status and status determined income, visible poverty was not merely embarrassing, it was a material threat. This is the detail that most popular accounts of the samurai elide entirely. The image that persists, the serene warrior sustained by a code rather than a payroll, above the considerations of money, is largely a later ideological construction. The formal articulation of Bushido as a philosophical system came primarily in the Edo period, when the samurai were increasingly a peacetime administrative class with few opportunities for actual warfare. That ethical framework developed as a response to the conditions of peacetime service, not as a description of how Sengoku period fighters actually operated. The samurai of the 15th century was not pondering philosophical texts about the way of the warrior while sharpening his blade. He was calculating what his fief produced, whether it would cover his campaign obligations, whether the lord's assessment of his performance would result in additional land grants or uncomfortable reassignment. He was thinking about supply, about rice, about whether his horses were fit, about how many men he could arm from his household's resources. Even the formalized ethics of the later period frequently collided with the practical demands of money. Domain records from the Edo period are filled with petitions from samurai seeking stipend adjustments or relief from accumulated debts. These were not men who had transcended material concern. They were men managing material constraint within a social framework that demanded they not appear to be doing so. 2.5 centuries of peace brought a specific kind of pressure the earlier system had never been designed to absorb. The military skills of the samurai were not, for most of that time, actually being used in warfare. The administrative machinery of the Han still required bodies, in gates, in offices, in ceremonial processions, but the economic rationale for a large warrior class had weakened. Meanwhile, commercial life was expanding. Rice prices fluctuated. Cash became more necessary for urban life. The fixed koku assessment that had made sense when drawn directly from managed land was now a monetary instrument processed through layers of administration and brokerage, losing value at each stage. Domains responded in various ways. Some reduced stipends during financial crises, issuing partial payments and promising restoration at a future date that sometimes never arrived. Some substituted cash for rice. Some issued domain-specific paper currency that could not be freely spent outside the Han. The samurai who served in the later Edo period were, in many cases, operating on thin margins within a system not designed to account for peacetime economics. The end of the Edo period brought the formal end of the stipend system. When the Meiji government dismantled the feudal domains in the 1870s, it simultaneously eliminated the hereditary economic privileges of the samurai class. The koku-based stipends sustaining samurai households across generations were commuted to government bonds in 1876. The practical effect was devastating for many. A bond was not a stipend. It required financial management and commercial knowledge, precisely the skills that generations of samurai ideology had discouraged. Former samurai, particularly those of lower rank, whose bonds were modest, found themselves without income and without the experience to convert that paper into sustainable livelihood. The class defined by its economic relationship to a lord found that relationship dissolved by a state that no longer needed what the class had historically provided. The warrior was always also an economic actor, embedded in systems of obligation, extraction, and dependency that shaped his daily life far more than any philosophical code. The rice stipend was not background detail, it was the central fact of samurai existence, determining where a man lived, what he ate, what he could maintain, and what his household's standing would be across generations. The system was never static. It moved from direct agricultural extraction to brokered cash conversion, from wartime logic to peacetime bureaucracy, until the Meiji state dissolved it entirely. The blade on his belt was ceremonial for most of his life. The rice in his stipend register was the thing that actually kept him standing. If you want to follow this further, what happened to the ronin who lost that register entirely, or how the merchant class quietly accumulated the wealth the samurai class was spending, that is a thread worth pulling.